All right, so our last paper of the conference, and thank you guys for being with us all the way through, is Ryan Randall, who will be presenting on LIS education and new conceptions of democracy.
Awkwardly going to be reading this off of the screen, but it means I'll be looking right at the microphone. LIS education and new conceptions of democracy. Democratic theory plays a surprisingly small role in LIS education, particularly given that the costs of archives, libraries, and universities are often justified for these institutions. For the people online, I'm now grabbing the slide advancing button. Democratic theory plays a surprisingly small role in LIS education, particularly given that the costs of archives, libraries, and universities are often justified for these institution roles in developing an informed citizenry. While we often have sustained discussions about access to information, open access publication, and the implications of copyright, we generally forego close examinations of democracy or the public as topics themselves. The common guise under which these issues appear in LIS literature, to me, seems to be diversity or multiculturalism. However, we far too often couch these discussions in ways that end up treating difference as the fault of people who might speak other languages, or as something that should be taught to us by the people we're seeking to include. At least in my program, the courses that come closest to providing sustained opportunity to nuance our understanding of democratic society are electives like intellectual freedom or information ethics. Otherwise, in classes that satisfy our core requirements, individual professors or students might bring in the topic of democracy through their choice of articles. But as was sort of just mentioned, it's not necessarily emphasized in the core things. So here's a slide of some of the core requirements in my particular institution at Indiana. So down towards the bottom, you can see, there's user services and tools, representation and organization. Then there's some other ones like library management. They all sort of help make sure that we hit the ALA accreditation, but none of them are sort of foregrounding democratic social conceptions. I'm not actually even advocating that that should be the name of the course. I'm just saying that they don't seem to be one of the main tracks of any of the courses that are the core requirements. So an example of this sort of class that a particular individual professor could incorporate it into is evaluation of resources and services, which despite its peculiar name is actually a sort of foundation course in social science methodology. In a time when accountability, assessment, and sometimes even austerity are the watchwords information workers face, it seems peculiar to neglect opportunities to supply LIS students the concepts and vocabularies needed to articulate how democratic society operates and the roles that libraries can play in it. Rather than leaving such a fundamental topic to elective courses or to individual syllabus decisions, I suggest that library and information studies intentionally incorporate discussions of democratic theory into our core classes. By doing so, LIS programs will help future information workers consider their actions within the broader context, as well as be able to explain them to others when necessary. That said, I would be vastly overstating the issue if I claimed that there is no precedent for these discussions within LIS literature. What I'd like to do in this presentation is to summarize 2 LIS articles that give us concepts to better understand democracy, then propose ways that newer notions of democracy might help ameliorate persistent issues facing library and information workers. I keep saying terms and concepts, so just to make it explicit, I'm sort of nodding my hat to Raymond Williams and Gal Deleuze, both of whom are big fans of using keywords or concepts as ways to sort of arm ourselves to think in new ways and contend with issues in new ways. Christine Pauli. She's provided a touchstone article that was in my intellectual freedom course, taught by Randall. This article helps to accessibly introduce the topic of hegemony and situate it within library and information studies. Hegemony's Handmaid, the Library and Information Studies curriculum from a class perspective, came out in 1998. Indeed, my own presentation today clearly follows in this article's wake, as its abstract finishes with the assertion that, quote, for the newly emerging information profession, To avoid political naivete, the LIS curriculum should include social theory as a tool for rigorous, theoretical, and empowering analysis of current far-ranging societal changes. That's the end of a sort of long quote. Scrutinizing the field of ILS through, I keep saying ILS because that's the name of my program, LIS. Anytime you hear me say ILS from now on, unless I say Indiana, just sort of replace all with LIS, please. Scrutinizing the field of LIS through the analytic lens of class, Pauli sees libraries and information studies practices as part of many middle-class practices that simultaneously obscure and extend the dominance of middle-class values and ways of thinking. The main terms I'll highlight from this article are, of course, hegemony, as well as class pluralism and managerialism. In general, these terms are all also related to processes that make meaning of what lies to processes of making meaning out of what lies in our resources and our documents, whether it's done so directly or indirectly. Right. The idea of hegemony was, as noted earlier, developed by Antonio Gramsci, and who was an elected member of Italian parliament, later incarcerated by Benito Mussolini's fascist party in the late 1920s. His emphasis on the role of culture and ideology in achieving and maintaining ruling class dominance was what many consider his main lasting contribution to Marxism and later critical theory. Pauli's summary of hegemony is worth quoting verbatim. A powerful group achieves hegemony when it gains control over a range of values and norms, to the extent that these are so embedded in society that they receive unquestioned acceptance. Published in 1998, So I just started to repeat that same paragraph. The primary things that Pauli emphasizes on class are that it is a relational and historical construct. She mentions that sociologists traditionally use the class theories of Karl Marx, who mostly views it as an economic issue, and Max Weber, who adds aspects of social status, political parties, and people's differing life chances based on class. Pauli suggests that E.P. Thompson provides a valuable addition to these notions of class by adding lived experience and culture as well as economic. So instead of just seeing class as primarily economic or being about life chances, it instead becomes a set of cultural fluencies and cultural practices. So it's things that we continually generate and regenerate through practices that we live. It's sort of a lived class notion. So with pluralism, Pauli moves into critiquing the dominant practices of library and information science. She states that in contrast to the societal focus of the class perspective, the pluralist perspective takes the individual as its unit of analysis. Instead of thinking of group dynamics and life chances, the key concepts here are the individual, behavior, conflict of interest, participation, and consensus. She argues that this perspective reinforces the notions of market-based competition, individual access, and exchange of ideas. The example she provides of this in libraries is the practice of Charlie Robinson, who's the former Baltimore County Public Library Director. Robinson frames customer orientation of a, quote, Charlie Robinson library as merchandising our collections. I don't see any reason for keeping a book if it doesn't move. What was the point of giving patrons what they didn't want? In my critical eyes, this Robinson approach seems to disavow responsibility for informed critical collection development, instead trusting that we can accurately account for and then assess all the relevant data points for collections and services. It's sort of just turning over a sort of responsible approach to collection development to whatever the market apparently wants. Somewhat in tension with pluralism, managerialism takes the organization as its level of analysis. The key concepts for this perspective are bureaucracy, elite, rationality, formal versus informal, and simple versus complex. Instead of the power of the market, here we have informed, capable elites who control decision-making by choosing which problems merit attention. This managerial perspective assumes that careful scientific study can allow for assessing effectiveness. As Pauli notes, decision-making is perhaps the key managerial activity. The rationalization involved in measurement and systems analysis is probably something we're quite common here. We're very familiar with it at this point in LIS. In general, Polly asserts that we need to become more aware of how these practices influence our work. All these practices provide crucial ways of understanding how what can perhaps appear neutral, like adopting a marketplace approach to collection, can actually instead forward a particular class's perspective. So now we'll move on to Mark C. Peterson and his article on Grassroots and Habermas in West Bend, Some Reflections. This focused on a censorship controversy that happened at West Bend, Wisconsin's West Bend Memorial Library. He argues that there were basically two main failures at play. The first is that while the books were protected, the librarian's employment was not. The West Bend Common Council voted to remove certain library board members from office after they successfully defended books from censorship attempts. As a professor of philosophy, Peterson says that the other failure was that the librarians in support of community members failed to realize that they were no longer working in a situation where the Common Council valued Enlightenment values. So he says that there's the failure of people having lost their jobs, there's also the failure of perception. So I'll run through this briefly because he favors Habermas, and I'm not as big of a fan, but what he's saying still supports my claim that we need to start talking about these social changes in LIS. So I'll briefly run through Habermas, because he does a very good example. He does a great job of introducing it. He mostly draws on John Buschmann, who's a library professor who's written quite a bit on the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. And what Jürgen Habermas talks about is the ascendancy of the public sphere as a space where claims of governmental authorities were put to debate by the public, sort of the public in general. So this notion of the public sphere being a counterbalance and a check to the governmental authorities, this was coming out of actual having a ruler, like a monarchy, moving towards what we now conceive of as sort of Republican democratic governance. The ascendancy of the public sphere is a space where claims of governmental authorities were put to debate by the public in general, which requires freedom of speech, access to reliable information sources, and many other things that we're quite familiar with from library ethics. So the authority does actually sort of, Habermas then goes on to talk about the fact that while there was this Enlightenment mode where we had the public sphere seems to be changing. And what I say that I think Peterson becomes a little bit wistful, and Habermas does as well for Enlightenment values. He says that I think he has a bit of nostalgia for that, which I find a little discomforting. So we can talk about that later, though. I'd rather talk about it with him here, actually, because I think I could learn from him, and I don't just want to say bad things about either Habermas or Peterson. So we'll move on to somebody who I would like to say nice things about. So Chantal Mouffe, and agonistic democracy. She's a professor who's been writing about political and democratic theory since at least the late 1970s. In effect, her work focuses on the fact that political questions are not something that elites can solve with better technologies or more accurate assessments. As she, her collaborator Ernesto Laclau, and a similar writer, Jacques Rancière, all repeatedly emphasize, properly political questions always involve decisions that require making a choice between conflicting alternatives. This is quoting her directly. These are conflicts for which no rational solution could ever exist. This means that we need to step outside of the traditional managerial and pluralistic perspectives, as they've been discussed by Polly and Peterson, to think more about how we can address these sort of political conundrums. There's three terms from Mouffe's analyses that I think would serve us well in library practices: agonistic pluralism, conflictual consensus, and pluralist democracy. The quotes on the next slides are all from her 2013 book, Agonistics Thinking the World Politically. Mouffe asks us to move beyond idealizing rationalized approaches and admitting that conflicts will exist. I'd suggest that this impossibility of an entirely rationalized approach has actually been felt throughout library history, which informs why things like the ALA Code of Ethics exist in the first place. So it's not new for us to be thinking of these concerns as being outside of reason. We need to have ethics. We need to have things to help guide us when we cannot just sort of rationalize away these conundrums. With agonistic pluralism, MOOF offers a way to rethink conflict in societies. Unlike the pluralism that Pauli discusses, MOOF's work stresses that the conflict of perspectives in pluralism actually operates under hegemony. Therefore, agonistic pluralism doesn't envision willy-nilly permissiveness or the nihilism of giving over collection development to a marketplace of ideas model. Instead, this perspective insists that for democracy, conflict is a feature, not a bug. So while as she writes, conflict in liberal democratic societies cannot and should not be eradicated, since the specificity of pluralist democracy is precisely the recognition and legitimization of conflict. Or, to put it another way, what is important is that conflict does not take the form of antagonism, which is struggle between enemies, but the form of an agonism, which is a struggle between adversaries. And a useful analogy to this is one that Lisa Hinchcliffe suggested that when we talked about this last night. The fact that in democratic courts, as we know them in the US, we require both a prosecutor and a defense in the belief that this conflict between them helps our larger society to determine an appropriate outcome. In an ideal court, the prosecution and defense sides don't treat each other as enemies precisely, but rather the court enforces that they at least nominally respect each other and operate as adversaries towards a common goal of finding justice, as opposed to just brutal power one over the other. So with conflictual consensus, MOOF contends that the prime task of democratic politics is not to eliminate passions or to relegate them to the private sphere in order to establish a rational consensus in the public sphere. Rather, it is to sublimate these passions by mobilizing them towards democratic designs, by creating collective forms of identification around democratic objectives. Again, rather than naively pursue a rationalized approach that ignores the complexities of collective identities and lived experience, the approach of conflictual consensus suggests that democracy would be best served by emphasizing that consensus happens within historical contexts. So we need to historicize. We need to recognize that the current consensus may not be the consensus 50 years from now, and certainly wasn't 50 years ago. Far too many people would not be voting. Far too many people would legally not have been able to vote just 50 years ago. Finally, rather than continuing to say democracy with no further explanation, I'd suggest that LIS workers consider discussing our role in an explicitly pluralist democracy in MOOF's understanding of these terms. As she writes, in a pluralist democracy, disagreements about how to interpret the shared ethico-political principles are not only legitimate, but also necessary. Since we cannot rationalize or managerialize our way out of the social environment that envelops LIS work, it would behoove LIS educators and students to incorporate discussions of what constitutes a pluralist democracy. While it will, of course, be up to students to determine whether or not to adopt this perspective, supplying them with terms and concepts to better conceive of and articulate their own approaches can only help them to develop the sort of reflexive praxis that is the goal of LIS education. Even when we focus on both theory and practice in library school, the theory discussions tend to be about ambiguities of comprehension rather than ambiguities inherent in reflexive practice. If we were to move from generally praising library and information workers' roles in broader democratic society and added more discussion of how societal forces impact and shape information work, we'll better prepare future librarians for the inevitable conflicts that we'll face. As MOOF's discussion of politics underscores, we cannot endlessly defer making decisions, but these decisions do not always have rational answers. Therefore, politics. I'd argue that we need to include these societal discussions when talking about things like assessment. Assessment allows us to make informed decisions, but we need to keep in mind that determining what to measure and how to do so itself involves choices, alternatives, and conflicts. Furthermore, Since patrons will make sense of the documents that we provide, it is worthwhile to include more discussions of pedagogy and things like textual studies, which can nuance our understanding of how users will make meaning out of whatever they access. So to be cautiously optimistic, perhaps this sort of change is afoot, and people have indeed been laying its foundation for quite some time. Barbara Pfister is just one precedent for advocating that we teach librarians not just how to access and share documents, or how to instruct patrons to do so, but to also treat these documents as texts whose meanings are negotiated in and through rhetorical situations. Also, the conversations around the new ACRL framework show that our professional discourse is moving away from treating information as a reified thing unto itself, and more towards treating it as an element in a process. I'd say we should talk more about this being a historical, social process. I suggest that we further specify and nuance these conversations with critical theories, such as the critical discussions of democracy shared by Polly, Peterson, and Muth. So, thanks.
We've got some time for questions, and got one already.
Hi, am I on? Okay. Oh, I hear myself now. Okay. Hi, this is Kyle Shockey again. And that was a great presentation. Thank you. I personally noticed, and you'd mentioned this in the middle of the presentation about wistfulness when it comes to Enlightenment values. I think that could certainly be said of the work of Bushman himself, as well as Ed D'Angelo. What I'm wondering is, what do we do about the marriage of Enlightenment and consumer values in neoliberalism? In this, yeah, an easy question.
Well, you clearly want the quick 1-minute answer, right? We resist. I mean, that's all we can do. We can't solve that. Neoliberals are part of our society. Neoliberals, we can disagree, and I believe you and I do, but they have their reasons. So what we can do is we can resist. And we don't dehumanize them, and we don't let them dehumanize us. So we resist. I mean, that's the short answer. The long answer is I have no idea.
Any other questions? Any questions online?
Might make a comment at this point. I've enjoyed all the afternoon's papers that are talking about a very challenging topic, since I teach one of the courses that gets involved with reading both Polly and other papers in terms of social justice and putting it up against the ALA intellectual freedom principles and policies. I should also, full disclosure, say I am a member of the Committee of Accreditation of the American Library Association, so I'm especially interested in the comments made by a number of you this afternoon. Wish I had time to pursue it further. But just going back into my over 40 years of being both a practicing librarian and a teacher in library and information science, in the 1960s, there were many issues. Civil rights was certainly a part of them. But the one that was, I found at this university when I was a graduate student, one of the most troubling was the Vietnam War protests on this campus, which resulted in all sorts of destruction on the campus, as there was really town and gown. I remember the entertainment in the Sunday afternoons in the late 1960s, early 70s was for the people from the county and outer points all the way to the Indiana border to drive through campus town and shake their heads that everything was going on in campus. And the question was, as LIS students at the time, and many of us were working in the libraries and assistantship positions, how do we take a stand of our personal commitment on this issue, and yet separated from the responsibilities as an employee of the university? And the reconciliation I personally came through at that time was the differentiation of roles, which is, I think, consistent with some critical thinking, certainly with Marxism, looking at myself in my different roles within the within the society. And so I felt quite comfortable in my role as a librarian of entering into instruction. At the time it was called teach-ins, which we held all over campus at that time. And then after my duties were done at the library, to put on my buttons opposing the Vietnam War and enter the marches. And many of the faculty, I was not a faculty member at the time, but many of the faculty also followed that particular pattern. And just like in the Salida case that is currently at issue, there was no consensus within the university or within the library school at the time. So I guess my response in sort of, well, perhaps supporting your position of we resist is that that's 40 years ago, and I still feel comfortable that we did not really give in, and the principles that the Social Responsibilities Roundtable and ALA stands for today still continue to be an opportunity for others to join as a result of the ability to survive the environment we're in. So I guess the long-term answer I would contribute would be survival is our goal, survival to continue the change.
Yeah. It's not an answer, but something that you were saying about the different roles made me think of, the fact, one thing that talking through sort of postmodernist critical theory things can give us is to perhaps be more comfortable with a sense of a non-unitary self that modernism would ask of us. So if we get to be more comfortable with the fact that we might not be able to change the world as we'd like to in our job, and instead we might need to have a role, if we have those 8, 8, and 8, we might have the 8 that allows us to survive those 8 hours. And then in those 8 hours when we're not sleeping, we can have other facets. We can have other labels. We can put on other hats and other metaphors to allow us to do things. So.
Okay, and I'm going to read a couple of comments from the online attendees. So, Martin says, he has just one comment. Social political roles of libraries are seriously underestimated in LIS education in most cases in Europe. Also, political science scholars could work together with LIS lecturers on these topics. There's a lot of potential for synergy in this direction. And then Adelaide McDonnell also says that she's surprised by how non-political her program is, despite being in a politically charged climate in Quebec. And so while many of the grad programs in Canada are voting on strikes, or maybe on campus, let me allow you to clarify that, or voting on strikes, that hasn't even been discussed in LIS. All right, any other questions? 2?
Hi, this is Adam Paradise again. In response to the faculty, in modes of resistance, I think it's worth considering that the Vietnam War protests, I don't know, the war went on. You all didn't stop the war. So we all have to acknowledge that survival, should that be our MO, means that we have blood on our hands. We all do. If we work for McDonald's, we have blood on our hands, no matter what we do with the other 8 hours, which could be very noble things. We might be doing very good work. Think of what it means to have actual moments of resistance. And again, I think we can go back to the Zapatistas and the EZLN as some sort of possible model. But again, they're creating worlds that are existing outside of their structures. Granted, NAFTA won, North America won, but they're still saying no. And they are resisting, as you say, but they're also saying, God damn it, no, and building their own worlds and not participating as much as they can in those other worlds. So survival sounds pretty comfy and all of that stuff. And we should remember that. Thank you.
Will you respond while I walk?
I don't know if I have a response to that. I think the more that we nuance things and the more that we talk about these complexities and complicities, as much as we can do that, either in classes or just among ourselves, it would be good. These are things with NAFTA as a solution that I don't know how LIS could even begin to approach. So not that we shouldn't have that be a thing that we talk about. But yeah, I think if we think more about how to arming I'm conflicted about using military metaphors even. But if we supply students with concepts to think through these things, I think that's only going to make it better, whether or not it'll help make solutions.
Hi, this is Kim, Illinois student again. I'm just thinking about the connections and distinctions between survival resistance and activism and advocacy, and going back to Scott Bonner at the Missouri Public Library, or the Ferguson Public Library, sorry. We, in one of my classes, we had the luxury of having him in the class to interview him and talk to him, and it was really interesting. But he, we were like, you're a radical, you're an activist, you're doing all these radical, awesome things. And he said, no, he said, I'm not. He said, I'm not a radical librarian, I'm not an activist, I'm just doing my job. I wanted to keep the library open. I wanted to fill these services and just do a service to my community, and that's my job as a librarian. And then after he left, we had a discussion about what that means that he would do this great thing that our profession uses an exemplary example of what we can do, of this is the ideal of, the activist work that we can do. And then for him to say, that's not activism, I'm not radical. And the difference between coming out and saying you're a radical librarian, coming out and being a political ally and making that statement, and kind of what that does to do radical things, but then not put that stick it to the man sticker on it. If that, yeah, what that does for us. So yeah, being a survivor and resisting, but also being an advocate.
Yeah. I think it's, I don't know, maybe an indictment of neoliberalism and this sort of sense that we have to live under a state of constant crisis, that something as possibly self-evident as having the library open functions as radicalism. That's an indictment. So it is, on one hand, it seems quite legitimate for him to say it's not radical at all. I opened the library to the patrons. But at the same time, when certain political leaders would want to justify a sense of constant crisis and constant sense of being imperiled, to say, no, these are my patrons, this is my community, the doors will be open, that is a way of pushing back without pushing back. So that's me saying historical context and specificities are important. And it's so sad that that's become radical.
Okay, do we have any final questions? Let's give a big round of applause for all of our presenters.